Chapter 30, A Many-Splendored Thing. A many-splendored thing. A gnome stood at the window, gazing out at the streets as dawn crept slowly over the rooftops. He sighed, a dull throbbing in his temples, his eyes hot through lack of sleep. But it was no good, exhausted though he was, every time he closed his eyes her face swam into view. Moira, his sister, so young and alive in his mind, the idea that she could be gone seemed almost impossible. He had cried at first, but not as much as he thought he would have, the rest of the night spent just laid upon his bed, steeped in his misery while the room darkened about him. But even that emotion was lost to him now, the dawn finding his sorrow buried under a weight of guilt. He should have been there to protect his sister, not just from her killer, but from her life at that rotting old house. A gnome felt his fists clench as he thought back to his father, the man taking a twisted pleasure in telling him how he had been forced to sell his mother's possessions and then the furniture to keep the creditors at bay, though a gnome noted the vile man had still been kept in drink. Why hadn't Moira told him the family was in trouble? He could have been able to help if only he had known. Perhaps she would have told you if you had been there to tell, a voice behind his eyes muttered cruelly, and for a moment his shame was almost crushing. He had been meaning to visit her for so long, but he had never managed to find the time. What would she think of him now, just stood idle while her killer roamed free? Perhaps his father had been right to banish him. But what if Serk is innocent? Challenged a voice that sounded remarkably like Frith's, and he sighed. The girl had been right. Awful though the situation was, it was the best course and he should not doubt it. A gnome tiredly closed his eyes, it was time for sleep. He did not know what made him glance to the window again. Perhaps some noise or movement on the edge of his senses. He only knew that he was suddenly watching Frith stroll along the street beneath him, the girl giggling lightly as she held out her scabbard to chime against the nearby railings before she suddenly broke into a run, charging the rest of the way to scatter a flock of drinking birds in a cloud of feathers, sending them skyward with her breathy laughter. He moved to the door, unsure of his behavior even as he acted, waiting until he heard her pass in the hall outside before throwing it open to make her start. "A gnome!" She gasped, cheeks flushed and eyes still bright, thought they darkened slightly as they saw him. "You frightened me." "Forgive me, my lady, but might I speak with you?" She watched him a moment longer, eyes searching his face with a pained look before nodding once, wordlessly moving past him into the room. The sharp morning air seemed to have clung to her, her aura of cold making his eyes seem all the hotter, and he moved to pour some water into the washstand and splash it across his face, unable to stand their gritty heat any longer. "You are thinking on your sister," came her voice behind him, and he turned to take the cloth she proffered, his voice muffled as he dried his face. "Yes. I cannot shake the feeling that there is more that should be done." "Well, we can investigate things if you believe we will find something the watch missed," she offered, her reluctance barely audible. He shook his head though. It was a fool's errand to look for evidence that was not there, and their time should be spent on the more pressing task of finding her friend, though it was kind of her to offer and he told her so. I just find it so difficult to see what is right anymore," he finished lamely, sinking onto the bed, his head in his hands. "I don't think I can help you, a gnome," Frith sighed, sitting on the chair opposite. "Helm should guide you here, you serve him, not me. I know how her death must weigh on you. You feel guilty, things you did, things you should have done. But in the end, none of it matters. Your sister will have known you cared for her and she cared for you as you were, a servant of Helm and the law." He glanced up to find her staring out of the window, though she heard him move and turned back to him gravely. "You said before you knew of Helm's teachings you were close to this priest in Candle Keep." Anomen. She sighed, looking apprehensive. We were not close in the way I may have led you to believe, our association more one of misbehavior and chastisement, though I think we had a relationship of sorts. Or at least I did believe so. She paused a moment, seeming to consider whether to continue, when she drew a breath and made her decision, eyes shifting back to the window as she spoke. I returned to Candlekeep only once since leaving with Gorion, and when I departed that second time, it was not under the best of circumstances. While there, I was framed for murder and without trial was sentenced to hang, a judgment Father Welland stood by. All our previous contact and the pain it clearly brought him could not sway him from the evidence against me and his chosen path, the service of his God, the service of the law. You think he did not act correctly? Frithia smiled wryly, her gaze returning to him. I think he thinks he acted correctly, even now, knowing I was innocent. Like I said, he was there to serve his God, not me. A silence fell between them, the seconds weighing on him as his mind went over and over all he should have done, on his failings as a brother, until he could not keep the feeling buried any longer, his voice choked with sorrow and guilt. I just miss her so much, I cannot believe she is gone. If only I had visited her, if she had told me. Oh, Anomen, Frithia said softly, her distress evident, the girl quickly moving to sit next to him, placing a hand lightly on his back and he could feel its cold through his tunic. You cannot do this, keep torturing yourself with what-ifs. Even if she had told you, what could you have done? You told me yourself Moira was devoted to your father's care, even if you found somewhere else for her to stay, do you think she would have left him under any circumstances? Frithia sighed gently. I know it is hard and that you have regrets, but you must try to let them go. Anomen nodded and drew a deep breath, straightening slightly. I know, I will try. And thank you, Frithia. She smiled weakly and he returned the gesture as best he could. But, you must forgive me, my lady, I keep you from your day. Frithia sighed and rose, clearly hearing her prompt to leave, her voice sounding suddenly old as she continued. I am sorry if my words hold little comfort for you, at the end of the day they rarely do more. But a very wise woman once told me that as time passes, hearts heal, and though it did not feel as though it would at the time, she was right. She patted his shoulder lightly and moved to the door. Try to get some rest, Anomen. He attempted to answer her but the words would not come and he settled for a nod, the girl lingering uncertainly in the doorway to add, and if you ever need to talk to someone, you know where I am. Frithia returned to her room, feeling suddenly tired and more than ready for her bed, though it was only a few hours later when Jahara woke her, the pair joining Nalia and Minsk in the common room for a very half-hearted attempt at breakfast, Frithia's stomach not appreciative of her late night. For the love of, exclaimed Jahara, glaring at the yogurt Frithia had been listlessly stirring with her spoon, as though half hoping it would just gradually disappear through the attrition. Stop pushing it about your dish and actually eat something. Yes, young Frithia, Minsk warned genially, Boo says you must eat up if you are to become big and strong. Frithia smiled in spite of herself, though the yogurt looked no more appealing for it. I don't mind breakfast, she sighed, I'd just prefer it if I could have it later, for instance. Lunchtime, finished Jahara curtly and the three laughed as Ari and Herr Dallas joined the table. The couple had returned from their walk quite late the night before, coming to sit with her and Aaron for a few minutes before retiring to leave them alone once more, something the elf seemed interested to discuss as she sat down opposite her. And what time did you get to bed last night? Ari asked her with a knowing smile, the table all looking up with interest. their amusement apparent. Frithla glanced up from her dish with a carefully nonchalant expression, mouth working furiously against a grin.
Just after you did.
Ari glanced to Nalia, who smiled broadly as well.
Truly? You were not in your room when I got up this morning.
Frithla flushed, about to tell them both to mind their own business when her stomach went cold. A gnomon had appeared on the stairs opposite and was moving towards their table.
I got up early and went to Mask's shrine,
she explained evenly. The girls looked uncomfortable, going wordlessly back to their food, and Frithla felt her guilt rise. As lies went, it was a mean one, for no one would question her now. But Aaron was not something she could share then, the joy of it inappropriate in the face of a gnomen's sorrow.
Ah, a gnomon,
began Herr Dallas solemnly as he noticed the squire arrive at the table, and Frithla realized it was the first time she had ever heard him use a gnomen's name.
I understand that words mean little at such times, but this sparrow offers his condolences, nonetheless.
Yes, came Ari next to him.
I am so sorry for your loss, a gnomon.
On the other side of the table, Minsk nodded gravely.
Indeed, to lose family is a terrible thing, but we will honor your kin with blade and deeds.
A gnomon stared at them a moment in hard silence, before something about his face softened and he nodded once.
My thanks. Would you like anything?
Frithla asked gently as he sat, putting down her spoon to serve him something, while Nalia set a cup before him and poured his tea.
Yogurt, or some bread perhaps?
He nodded vaguely, and Frithla cut him a few slices, pushing the butter and honey towards him as she handed him his plate.
We were just discussing our plans for the day,
she continued evenly, a lie, but one no one saw fit to correct her on. The man swallowed a mouthful of tea, glancing up from his cup to answer her.
I have the intention to hold a small service for Moira at the Temple of Helm, just for her friends and those who knew her best. If I could be excused my duties for the next couple of days while arrangements are made. But, of course. I mean, whatever you wish, a gnomon.
Frithla stuttered, feeling mortified that he had felt he had to ask.
The rest of us merely have plans to look for work.
He nodded once and dropped his attention back to his dish, Frithla turning miserably back to her own, her melancholy only heightened when she saw it still full of uneaten yogurt. A silence seemed to descend upon the table from that moment on though, and she was glad when breakfast was finished, the group leaving the table as one to attend their various tasks about the city. A gnomon left promptly for the Temple of Helm, she and Jahara planning to head across the river to look at the bounties, while Nalia and Minsk returned to the Goldsmith's Guild and leaving, in Jahara's words, the highly efficient pairing of Herr Dallas and Ari to ask about the temples. Frithla watched a gnomon walk down the street to be lost in the crowds before turning to the woman next her with a sigh and a tired smile.
Right, over to the council buildings then.
Jahara nodded, falling into step with her as they set off for the bridge, the woman smirking slightly as she asked,
So what time did you get to bed last night?
Frithla grinned.
Just after sunup. Oh, Frithla!
Jahara exclaimed, her amusement audible, and that going to temple nonsense?
I walked him back to the docks,
she confessed, really giggling now. Embarrassed though Frithla was to admit it, she had not felt quite so smitten about anyone since Baldur's Isle, and it had been a slight source of worry for her, that the shock of what had occurred there had somehow removed the sensation from her for good. Her attraction to Herr Dallas had been genuine enough, but still very calculated, influenced as much by practicality as her own feelings, and she had wondered whether all other attachments from then on would be born of her mind rather than her heart. Frithla glanced to the woman next to her, suddenly desperate to share her feelings with someone.
I know it sounds stupid. It usually does,
Jaehaera interrupted dryly, and Fritha grinned, continuing without pause.
But I had been worried. Because the last time I met someone well.
She swallowed, her high spirits flickering as she remembered the boy she had lost what felt like a lifetime ago. Jaehaera seemed to understand though, nodding for her to continue.
Well, I was worried that perhaps something inside me had changed and all regard from then on would be born of the mind rather than born by the butterflies. The butterflies,
repeated Jaehaera incredulously, and it had been worth telling the druid for her look alone.
Yes, that feeling when you look at someone, when they speak just a few words to you, mild and ordinary, and suddenly there's that rush of warmth and 1,000 butterflies are flitting about your stomach.
Jaehaera rolled her eyes but smiled all the same. There had always been something about Fritha's joy that was infectious.
And the butterflies were there last night, were they? Oh yes. Bloody swarms of them.
The girl cried with obvious delight, her smile fading slightly as she continued.
Dear Aaron, I shall likely never see him again, but the butterflies they linger still, fluttering lazily in my stomach, whispering to me, be wary, Fritha, for when you least expect it, we will strike. Bwa ha ha hey.
She finished, her manic laughter soon lost to warm giggling. Jaehaera laughed too, suddenly filled with such an overwhelming fondness for the girl that she could not help but throw an arm about her shoulders to give her an affectionate squeeze.
Oh girl, you will be the jewel of someone's eye one day.
Fritha grinned.
Well, if you meet him before I do, send him Minsk's way, that man has plans for him.
The pair returned to the coronet just after noon, though with nothing to show for their trip, the few bounties that were on display there unsuitable for a group of their size, and they entered the tavern to find Nalia and Ari already at a table. Herr Dallas and Minsk were in the common room as well, but strangely not sat with them. The men stood together at the bar, though the reason for which soon became apparent as she and Jaehaera approached the table, the girls so earnestly discussing her Ren that it took them a moment to notice their arrival. Jaehaera rolled her eyes and muttered something about putting her bag in her room before heading off towards the stairs, Fritha dumping her own bag and cloak under her chair as she sat.
Hello, find anything?
She asked hopefully. Both girls shook their heads and Fritha shrugged.
Neither did we. Oh, well, the day is young. Why are Minsk and Herr Dallas at the bar? Oh, they're just ordering some food,
dismissed Ari, and Fritha smirked slightly as her mind added still.
Anyway, never mind them.
Continued the elf keenly,
what really happened with you and Aaron last night? I assume you didn't go to temple this morning.
Nalia nodded, frowning slightly.
And while we're on the subject, that was really rather mean of you. I felt awful when I thought I had been teasing you about Aaron and you had been off praying for Imoen. A necessary evil, I'm afraid,
said Fritha with a shrug.
Inomen was not going to arrive at a table brim full with laughter. And as for Aaron and I, we talked till the dawn, then I walked him back to the docks and he left. End of story. You talked until the dawn,
confirmed Ari, looking a picture of bliss.
Oh, that's so romantic. What did he say when you parted?
Asked Nalia. Fritha gave a bemused frown.
Bye. Fritha.
The girls chorused.
For the love of,
Fritha began tersely, her stomach feeling hot as she thought back to the tunnel of the customs house. The man stood before her in her mind, smiling gently.
He said something like, safe journey, Fritha. Or maybe I said that.
She considered, it was hard to recall with him looking at her so.
"Oh, I don't know," she sighed eventually, "what does it matter? He's gone now. I'll probably never see him again."
Ari sent her a pained look.
"Oh Firtha, we're sorry. If you don't want to talk about it."
Firtha frowned slightly.
"Honestly, Ari, it's hardly a tragedy worthy of the stage. I was only with him for an evening, which, yes, was very nice, but now he's gone, as we all knew he would, and I am fine."
She laughed slightly at their unconvinced expressions.
"Honestly, it's all right."
But this clearly was the wrong thing to say, and after a few moments more of the girl's furious questioning, Firtha decided to see where the maid had got to and join the men at the bar.
"Hello, you two,"
she greeted, the pair glancing up at her arrival, Minsk smiling broadly.
"Ah, young Firtha. You have a glorious adventure to lead us on, yes?" "Sorry, not yet. Why are you two hiding up here anyway?"
Minsk shook his head, frowning slightly.
The girls were acting a little strangely. And so shrill. To hear them made Boo's ears hurt.
Firtha smiled, glancing to the hamster in question, Boo scurrying about the counter before them, man serving behind it looking as though he would have told anyone but Minsk to remove the creature.
"So, are they hurting your ears too?"
she asked the man on the other side of her as Minsk turned his attention to his little friend, Herr Dallas looking up from his drink with a sullen frown.
As well you may have guessed, my raven. All evening I wooed my dove, with verse enough to soften a succubus's callous heart, and all she can talk of today is your seafaring wren."
The tiefling sighed and glumly took another drink.
"No sparrow should have to listen to his bird singing another man's tune." "Oh, quit your jealousy, Bard," she laughed, "the only songs I ever hear Ari singing are in the key of H. She probably just doesn't want you to know how keen she is on you."
Firtha nodded wisely.
"Girls are like that. And, I'll warrant the only reason she is all excited about Aaron is because he and I supposedly have this tragic hopeless love thing going on, and Ari is the sort of girl who enjoys romance for romance's sake."
Herr Dallas frowned, seeming to consider her words a moment before a smile lit his eyes.
"Was it ever so? Ah, my raven, forgive this foolish bard his envy. Ari has taken a far stronger hold of my heart than I would have thought possible, and I cannot help but lose myself to it while I have the chance."
He sighed dramatically.
"Though entropy affects even love, I will deeply mourn the end of this when it comes."
Firtha smiled, glad to hear the bard's feelings in this were as strong as Ari's, even if his philosophy was less than romantic.
"Yes, but look on the bright side,"
said the girl with a smirk.
"You might die before that happens." "And,"
Herr Dallas continued as though she had not spoken,
"though such things are doomed to end, I am sorry, at least for your sake, that the wren has flown. You made a fine pair."
Firtha shrugged.
"As soon as I met him, I knew he was leaving, so it seems a little silly to get upset about it. I mean, I wasn't unhappy before he came, why should I be now he has gone?"
Herr Dallas shook his head with a sigh.
"Ah, the ever-pragmatic raven, do you never tire of being sensible?"
Firtha grinned.
"Watch your tongue, Bard, I've killed men for lesser insults. Besides, perhaps I shall see him again in another 8 years or so. Stranger things have happened."
She gave a bark of laughter,
"And to me as well."
Herr Dallas seemed considerably cheered after this, and they spoke a few moments more until the maid finally brought Firtha's drink and she moved back the table. The conversation had returned to more familiar topics in her absence, the elf recounting her evening with the bard and enjoying the tale far more than her audience was by the look of Nalia. Frithha smiled. How onto real could the bard doubt Ari's affections? The girl never shut up about him.
We walked through the park just a few streets from the council buildings, and on the way back we stopped on the bridge and watched the moon.
The elf sighed, clearly reliving some private moment behind her eyes, and the girls shared a smirk.
He said he would trade all of Sigil for my smile.
Frithha frowned slightly. For Herr Dallas, Sigil was the center of the multiverse. She doubted he'd willingly swap the city for anything. But perhaps Ari knew that too. Frithha considered practically, the elf could just be pleased he had thought to say it, true or not.
Then we practiced some more on our play. He said I possessed a talent for acting that many an actress he had known would envy. I think he was exaggerating, but it was so nice of him to say.
Ari continued, smiling. Nalia sighed audibly, and the elf glanced back to them, blushing slightly and looking apologetic, though her smile remained.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't mean to go on. It's just as though my head is filled with him. And when we're together, oh, I just can't describe it. Eeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeeee
The girls looked to each other, seemingly nonplussed, Ari turning back to venture,
Sorry.
Frithas swallowed her mouthful and smiled.
That's how I'd describe it, that first rush of love. It's like
Nalya and Ari paused a moment before they both began to nod slowly.
Yes, I suppose that would be close,
agreed Ari, sending her a contemplative look.
But, that sounds like quite an accurate description for someone who's never been in love.
Fritha felt her face grow hot.
I read it in a book, of course,
she dismissed hastily, but Nalya looked skeptical.
You read in a book? Well, I'm paraphrasing.
Fritha laughed, lightly slapping her arm and more than ready to turn the conversation away from her.
So Ari, you like Herr Dallas then?
She confirmed with what had to be the weakest attempt at redirection ever, but the elf just sighed wistfully and nodded.
It's all so soon, but I can't help thinking he might be the one. The one what?
Questioned Fritha artlessly, and Nalya gave a rather indelicate snort into her cup, Ari frowning as she explained.
The one person in all the planes created solely to be with you. Oh, him,
said Fritha casually as the girl next to her began to laugh, Ari giving a frustrated sigh.
Of whom are we speaking?
Came a voice above her and Fritha smiled as Jahara finally rejoined them.
The one,
she explained, with a nod to the elf opposite,
Ari was just telling us. Can you believe, there's this one man in all the world meant for me alone?
She shrugged nonchalantly, a grin pulling at her mouth.
Personally, I hope he doesn't pitch up too soon, so many boys, so little time. Fritha.
Came the girls, predictably scandalized as Fritha laughed merrily at their outrage. Jahara rolled her eyes, a certain tightness to her jaw.
By Sylvanus, Ari, please save your romantic nonsense for occasions when I am not about to eat.
Ari sent the druid a scowl, but any reply she may have made was cut off by the slam of the door, a no-man walking over to the table looking as though he had the weight of Altareal on his shoulders.
Hello, a no-man,
Fritha greeted quietly as he arrived.
How are the arrangements going?
Fine, he answered curtly, a frown creeping across his face as he continued.
My father is refusing to give over Moira's ashes to be scattered, but I expected as much. As for the service itself, all who have been invited plan to attend, apparently, Lord Cor held the service for her cremation in private and many are glad for such a chance. It is to be held tomorrow evening at the Temple of Helm. High Watcher Oisig has honored me by agreeing to perform the ceremony. Now, if you will excuse me.
He turned to leave and Fritha was on her feet before she could draw breath.
But, well, won't you join us? We were about to eat.
He glanced back to her and she thought he would change his mind, but after a moment he slowly shook his head.
No thank you, my lady. There are matters I must attend to.
Fritha slumped back into her chair with a disheartened sigh, the men joining them soon after as the maid finally arrived with their food, and the conversation moved on to more mundane matters. Nalia and Ari apparently had things to buy, Fritha agreeing to accompany them to the promenade with a plan to ask around the merchants there for work. Jahara had plans as well it seemed, the woman saying she would go with Minsk to look through other sources, as did Herr Dallas, though neither explained further and the girl did not see the need to question them.
Right,
Fritha finally sighed as Ari finished the last of her pair.
Let's go if we're going. Can you see that a no man eats something?
She added to the woman still seated. Jahara muttered something about that being a proper sentiment coming from her, but agreed all the same and Fritha left with the girls, the bright autumn sunshine going a long way to lift her spirits as they made their way to promenade, Ari keeping up a constant tirade on that druid as they went. The great tiered arena of Joaquin's promenade was just ahead of them now, the sandstone looking warm and dusty under the afternoon sun, and the three made their way up the western steps. Ari was still deep in the throes of her rant about Jahara, Fritha sending Nalia a smile as they ascended, the elf an amusing echo of Imoen long past.
I can't believe her, she is just so rude all the time. What's so funny?
Ari demanded, suddenly turning to catch her smiling, and Fritha held up her hands in a conciliatory gesture.
Peace Ari, you just reminded me of someone for a moment, I wasn't laughing at you.
The elf looked suitably abashed by this, her anger finally dying.
Oh, of course, I'm sorry. Jahara just makes me so cross sometimes.
Fritha smiled gently.
I know, but try to be patient with her, she is finding life so hard at the moment with Khalid gone.
Ari covered her mouth with a hand, instantly dismayed.
Oh yes, her husband. She so rarely speaks of him I sometimes forget. Fritha.
She continued tentatively, what was he like? Fritha sighed deeply, halting in the shadow of the western archway and half closing her eyes as she summoned memories of the man.
He was kind. And warm, and mild, not unlike Kuldorn, now I think about it. He never raised his voice in anger and he was hers. To see them together, to turn and catch them in some kiss or tender glance.
She shook her head.
It was like watching love played out before your eyes.
Fritha paused a moment, a glimmer of the emptiness Jahara must have to face every day hovering on the edge of her senses, and she wondered how the woman coped at all.
I have lost many in my time here, but I cannot imagine the yawning hole his passing must have left within her. To find someone who so completes you and then to have him stolen away. I could survive it, but what would be the point? The world would be empty from then on. Oh, Fritha.
Ari breathed, looking heartbroken,
there could be another perhaps, in her future.
Fritha nodded evenly.
Quite possibly, but he would not be Khalid. I don't know.
She continued with a sigh,
perhaps I am too dark in my outlook. Hearts heal just as every other part, with care and time, and perhaps there is someone out there made to help her. But after finding one such as he...
Fritha shrugged mildly, turning back to gaze out over the promenade.
I would not bother to look. So, where would you like to go?
The two girls seemed more than happy to just follow her though, and Fritha led the way over to the eastern end, stopping at each stall they passed to inquire about work, the merchants friendly for the most part. But no one knew of anything, and at last they came to the final stall, and the first one Fritha had ever visited in Athkatla, memories of the owner's kindness staying with her, and it was there she planned to spend her limited funds. The thick-set merchant and his two boys did not recognize her, but it did not matter, and she chatted idly with the man as she stocked up on soap and oil and other goods, the girls moving off to look at a nearby jeweler's stall.
And another 40 of arrows please,
she finished, gesturing to the basket behind the man.
Barbed?
He asked, and Fritha smiled.
Why not?
He nodded, stooping to collect them and sending a glance to his sons to ensure they were gathering together the rest of her purchases before politely turning back to her, carefully wrapping the arrows as he spoke.
Are you with one of the caravans then, m'lady? I heard the last few were planning on leaving the city over the next day or so, before the winter sets in. No, we're just mercenaries,
Fritha answered with a shake of her head, before continuing eagerly,
but do they need escorts, do you know?
The merchant paused to hand her the now wrapped arrows, rubbing a contemplative hand across his chin.
Ah well, not that I know of. There used to be a bandit group working the road south out of the city, and at the time the caravans couldn't have been keener to hire mercs as guards for the journey. But apparently the bandit leader was killed along with most of his group, I'd say a few days ago now, and the caravans have just dropped back to their usual escorts, so there are quite a few in your position.
He gave her a commiserating look, though in reality Fritha felt more like laughing at the irony of the situation, the girl suppressing it to nod and sigh.
Oh well, if you hear of anything.
The merchant smiled, taking her payment as his sons appeared with the rest of her goods.
I'll be sure to keep it to myself until I see you, m'lady. My thanks, sir. Good business.
She smiled, turning back to find the girls waiting patiently for her to finish, and together they moved on. Nalia wanted a set of heavier traveling robes as her old ones were no longer warm enough when they camped out, and so they made their way across the promenade to a plain canvas tent set against the southern wall, a stout swarthy man with a nose curved like a scimitar greeting them as they approached.
A pearl to you ladies,
he began, his voice tinged with an accent Fritha recognized as Alzito.
I have a new stock of silks within, direct from Kalimshan and for only. That will not be necessary, thank you,
Nalia cut in politely.
I am looking for traveling robes, ready-made and preferably wool, though a heavy linen would do just as well. Of course,
the merchant cried, hiding his disappointment behind a genial smile, the man pulling back the canvas next to him and ushering them into the pavilion.
But take a step inside, ladies, and I am sure we will find something to please you.
Inside, the tent had been divided by canvas hangings, and the man led them into the main chamber. A large table, no doubt for cutting cloth, stood by the entrance, the rest of the walls lined with rails of ready-made clothes and bolts of fabric, a tall mirror leant against the tent frame.
If you wish to try anything on, please just go through the curtains,
he smiled, gesturing to a small alcove in the back of the chamber, just visible through the plain linen hangings, before he left them to their own devices, clearly deciding his time would be more profitably employed calling more affluent customers to his wares. Nalia moved instantly over to the racks of robes, Ari drifting absently along the rails of the other ready-made dresses and undergarments, and Fritha moved to stand next to one of the canvas partitions, distracting herself with the murmur of the noblewomen in next room.
So we shall have 8 yards in the green, turquoise, and the yellow each,
said a woman who put Fritha in mind of Nalia's aunt, though she sounded much more friendly.
As you wish, my lady,
came a male voice, accented as the merchant's had been, though it sounded younger. Another younger voice, but a girl's this time, and one that sounded less than pleased.
But, my last dress took 10 yards.
A matronly sigh.
Yes, dearest, but this autumn the fashion has dresses of a straighter cut, any more than 8 would be a waste.
But mother, the girl cried, clearly distressed,
what if fuller skirts regain favor later in the season? There won't be enough.
Frithia smiled faintly, wondering what it would be like to have such worries as she drifted away from the wall, moving over to where Nalia was running an eye over a handsome set of sky blue woolen robes, lined and trimmed in a deep amber linen.
These are perfect, but 21 gold pieces,
she sighed, frowning slightly as she glared at the price.
Even with haggling that will still be about 19, I hadn't wanted to spend so much. 19,
Frithia considered aloud.
It would probably be cheaper to buy the wool and make it yourself.
Nalia turned to her, eyes wide.
You can sew? I mean actually make clothes. Course,
Frithia laughed.
Beth, the cook back in Candlekeep taught me. Together, we would make all my clothes, Imoen's too. Though I haven't done it for a while and never without her help. Still.
She grinned,
you never know until you try.
Nalia frowned slightly and went back to looking through the racks of robes. Though Frithia did not doubt that Nalia agreed with such a sentiment, the girl was clearly reluctant to experiment when it came to her outfit. Frithia smiled, glancing back to where Ari was stood holding one of the petticoats up to herself and gazing longingly at her reflection, the narrow bodice opening out into a wide billowing skirt, the hems heavy with lace.
That's beautiful, Ari,
Frithia sighed, watching the skirts as the elf turned back and forth,
all frothy, like freshly churned milk. Are you going to buy it? I don't know. How much is it?
The girl questioned, reaching tentatively for the neat square of parchment that had been pinned to the breast, her jaw dropping as she read it.
24 gold pieces. Why, I could buy a fur-lined cloak for that. You can.
Came Nalia absently, now poring over a set of heavy blue-grey robes.
You must show us where then, the weather will warrant them soon enough.
Ari threw her a frown.
Oh, you know what I mean. But, 24 gold you could at least buy robes for the same. Or less,
the girl quipped, finally deciding on the blue and amber robes she had originally seen and taking them outside to make payment. Ari was still mooning over the petticoats as Frithia turned to see who she assumed was the merchant's son walk in, his arms straining under 4 bolts of Kalamshite silk, the women he had been serving finally having made a decision it seemed. By the man's manner, she put him at a few years her senior, and he had the look of his father though much leaner, his hair dark and skin swarthy with sharp aquiline features. She watched as he laid the bolts upon the table, deftly unrolling ream upon ream of the light material until he had the desired length before taking up his shears to cut it, the rippled pile of turquoise cloth shimmering next to him and complementing his coloring most beautifully. He was handsome, Frithia decided, but not so old yet that his looks were obvious to him, and this slight uncertainty made him all the more attractive. He glanced up from the cloth he was cutting to throw her a smile, and she returned it before turning back to Ari.
I think Nalia's finished, are you ready to go?
The girl sighed, hanging the petticoat back over its rail with a nod.
Yes, I suppose there is little point in prolonging things.
Outside, Nalia had managed to haggle the price down to 19 and 4 as she had hoped, and they moved a pace or two from the tent to wait for the girl to push the large wrapped bundle into her bag. It was getting late in the afternoon now, a few of the merchants about them beginning to pack up for the day, and Frithia left the pair with plans to visit her theatre, the girl disappearing through the few knots of customers still browsing the stalls in search of a good deal. Nalia watched her go before turning back to Eri with a smile, the girls falling into step with each other as they made their way slowly towards the western archway, stopping at various stalls as they went. Nalia smiled as Eri showed her the necklace she had just bought. It was nice to be friends once more, and though she would have rather died than admit it, she had missed the elf's company over the last 10 days. If it had not been for Fritha, Nalia suspected she would have found herself quite lonely. They had passed under the western arches now, walking through the cobbled plaza outside where merchants not fortunate enough to own a pitch within the promenade set up their wares in amongst the fountains, though most had packed up for the day now, the square empty barring a few traders and their carts. The girls headed north, skirting the curved wall of the promenade, and they had almost left the square when a rough voice caught Eri's attention.
"I warned you, Fald."
Two men were stood half-hidden behind a fountain in a half-loaded cart, the shorter one a merchant by his appearance, the other taller and stocky, his face screwed up in an angry frown.
"This is your last chance, mate. Pay your fee or I'm coming back with others."
But the merchant was either not afraid or not willing to show it, for though he took a step back, no fear showed on his face and his voice did not betray him either.
"Fee? Ha! You're not a guild member and you couldn't extort coin from me even if you were. I'll not pay you a copper, so leave me be."
The man bristled, laying a hand pointedly on his sword hilt.
"You'll pay this instant, or so help me I'll." "You'll what?"
snapped a shrill voice, and Nalia threw a glance to the girl next to her, Eri nearly trembling with anger.
"I'll leave him alone."
The man seemed alarmed a moment before his eyes found them beside the fountain, and it was the relief in his face that annoyed Nalia as much as anything, his words just as dismissive.
"Move on girls, this ain't any of your business." "Oh, I would disagree,"
said Nalia coolly, taking the bow from her shoulder with slow smooth movements.
"Step back from him now or you will be more than sorry."
A light was crackling menacingly between Eri's fingers and he looked back and forth between them before raising his hands.
"Hey now, let's not be so hasty. I wasn't really going to hurt him." "Well, I doubt the watch will see it that way,"
added the merchant almost gleefully.
"They take a poor view of anyone upsetting us traders here in the city of coin." "Oh, hells take the lot of you!"
The man swore vehemently, dropping his hands to turn on his heel and march off toward the slums. The merchant laughed deeply.
"Ha! Watch him go! He's been pestering me for days. I knew he was all talk, though it was nice to have a bit of help."
He dipped a quick bow.
"Fald Irosin at your service. If there is aught I can do to repay your kindness, ladies, please speak it now. I am part of a caravan bound for trade meat and we leave at sunset."
They both politely refused him though, the merchant nodding and going back to unhurriedly loading his cart. Nalia glanced to Eri with a smile.
"Right, shall we?" "La ladies!"
cut in a small voice somewhere below them, and Nalia turned to see a boy of about 8 winters, a grubby hand reaching up tentatively as though about to tug Eri's sleeve. The elf smiled, crouching down to speak with him, and Nalia wondered if Eri had had much experience of dealing with children in the circus. Nalia knew she certainly had not.
"Oh, hello there, are you lost?"
He glanced between them nervously and Nalia offered him a smile, the boy turning back to Eri as he answered.
No, I was looking for, well, someone who could help and I saw you,"
he gestured vaguely to the merchant behind them,
and I thought maybe you could help us."
"Us?" questioned Nalia.
"Yes, m'lady. I'm Delon and my village, Imsvale, in the Umar Hills is in danger. Some people have been found dead and there's ogres and wolves and maybe even the Umar witch. So they sent us to get help, only we got lost in the city and robbed. And Blail, he's my older brother, well, his leg was hurt, and he can't walk so well at the moment, so I've been looking for people who can help us while he's resting in the temple. The Ilmaterans are looking after him,"
he added cheerfully, his nervousness quite gone in the course of his tale. Nalia shot Ari a look.
"I thought you and Herr Dallas were supposed to ask about the temples this morning." "We did, but we have not had a chance to ask in the slums yet. Herr Dallas wanted to go to the temple district first, he likes to watch the Talosians' lightning cages,"
Ari added with a fond smile. Nalia rolled her eyes, glancing back to the boy to confirm.
"So you've been sent to hire mercenaries?"
Delon nodded, Nalia turning to the girl next to her and lowering her voice.
"What do you think? I don't like to say we will without checking with the others first." "Well," began Ari thoughtfully, "what do you think Fritha would say if she was here?"
They both turned as one to the boy before them, his grubby face lit with an innocent hope. Nalia smiled.
"We would be happy to help, Delon."
The boy beamed.
"Oh, thank you, Miss M'lady. Everyone will be so pleased."
Nalia nodded once.
"Good, now how old is your brother, Delon?" About 15 winters, m'lady,"
he answered, his smile fading slightly.
15.
Muttered Ari with a frown.
"We can't let them make the way back to Umar alone." "Well, that is true enough, though they cannot travel with us. I wonder whether—"
Ari trailed off, glancing over to Fald who was still slowly packing his cart.
Excuse me."
As it was, Fald seemed more than happy for a chance to repay his debt to them, the merchant agreeing to take the boys as far as trade meet himself and see the pair safely onto a caravan passing through Umar, and Delon left moments later, excitedly running off to fetch his brother, still shouting his thanks back to them as he went. Nalia smiled, though there was a slight uncertainty lingering beneath it, and by the look of Ari she was worrying too. Nalia sighed inwardly. There was little point fretting about it now, they had promised to help, and whether or not the others approved, that was that. Next to her, Ari still looked anxious though.
"Do you think we should have found out how much they intend to pay us?"
Nalia shrugged.
"Quite possibly. And we did not ask the boy whereabouts the village is in Umar,"
Ari continued, glancing back along the street as though hoping he would reappear.
"That is true."
Ari frowned and bit her lip.
"Do you think Jahara will ask us when we tell her?" "Oh, I should imagine so."
"Nalia!" the elf cried, clearly cross that she was not taking her concerns seriously.
"Well, Ari,"
she laughed, feeling suddenly light-hearted. Fritha's madness was catching, it seemed.
"What is the point in worrying about it now? It is done. And Jahara will scold and Fritha will sigh, but we will all still go as agreed and the world will turn."
She sent the girl next to her a smile, glad to receive one in return, albeit tentatively.
"Come, we shall face it together."
And they fell into step once more, making their way back to the inn. End of chapter.